Darren Cole wanted control. Andre Blitz Barrett wanted revenge. Reese and Ryan Foley wanted profit. But when these names collided on the blood-soaked streets of London, what followed was a gang war unlike anything the UK had ever seen. Ruthless, calculated, and unstoppable. This is the true story of power, betrayal, and the criminal empire that rose from the shadows. East London, 2014. The sun had barely risen most days before the streets were already awake with tension. Concrete housing estates loomed like cold giants, each tower block a silent witness to a brewing war. Among the gray buildings and worn-out football courts, a group of teenagers started something they never fully understood. A gang that would later make national headlines under the name East Edge Crew. At the center of it all was Darren Cole. He wasn't loud, didn't wear flashy chains, and didn't post threats online like others his age. But what he lacked in noise, he made up for in presence. Darren had a stare that froze people mid-sentence. Those who knew him said he didn't blink when he was angry, and he rarely smiled unless something dark had amused him. At 19, he had already buried a brother and seen 2 close friends die in street violence. Unlike the others, Darren wasn't chasing clout, he was chasing control. The East Edge Crew began as a group of 6 school dropouts, bored of broken homes and empty fridges. They started small, stealing bikes, tagging walls, reselling burner phones. At first, it was all adrenaline and laughs. But everything shifted when Darren's older brother, Malcolm, was killed in a knife ambush. It happened just outside a convenience store in broad daylight. Witnesses said they saw 3 masked men chase him across the street, one of them repeatedly stabbing him until he collapsed against a bin. No one stepped in. No one called for help. Malcolm bled out before the ambulance even arrived. The police called it gang-related. No arrests were made. Darren called it a declaration of war. He stopped smiling after that. He stopped trusting anyone outside the 6-man circle. The crew became sharper, more organized. They held meetings in basements and abandoned flats. Darren created a code of silence that spread like a virus. No phones during jobs, no names during runs, no faces online. They weren't just another gang posting threats on social media. They moved like shadows and struck without warning. Their territory was the east side of the city. Barking, Canning Town, Plaistow. Darren made sure every block knew who owned it. Local dealers were either forced out or absorbed into the crew. Teenagers were recruited from playgrounds and offered money to run errands. Most joined not out of loyalty but out of fear. Anyone who refused was publicly humiliated, beaten, or worse, exposed on social media with allegations no street kid could walk away from. The crew's real money started flowing when they linked up with an older man known only as Uncle Des. No one really knew his full name or where he came from, but Des had connections, drug suppliers, stolen car rings, and even a few corrupt warehouse managers who turned blind eyes to packages moving in and out of East London docks. Through Des, Darren got his hands on large quantities of cocaine and cannabis, which he then distributed using a tiered system. Young runners made deliveries using bicycles or mopeds. Each kid earned just enough to feel rich, but not enough to walk away. Violence was inevitable. A rival group from South London, the South Blades, had long claimed parts of East Territory as their own. The 2 crews exchanged threats online, but things escalated when one of Darren's closest boys, Tyrell, was found unconscious near a canal with deep slash wounds on his back. Darren didn't wait for a green light. That night, 3 members of the South Blades were ambushed at a bus stop and stabbed. 2 survived. 1 didn't. From that point on, it wasn't about turf, it was about survival. Darren's crew began carrying knives everywhere. Some even had guns, though few dared to use them openly. Police started to notice the change. East London had always struggled with youth violence, but this was different. It was coordinated, precise, and spreading. Word of Darren's leadership spread fast. Other gangs took notice. Some feared him, some wanted to join him, but most wanted him dead. The media hadn't caught on yet, but the locals had. They whispered about a new breed of gang leader, one who didn't party, didn't post, and didn't play games. The East Edge Crew was no longer just a gang, it was a machine. Ruthless, growing, and controlled by a teenager who had nothing left to lose. What started as a response to one brutal murder had turned into a storm sweeping across East London. And Darren Cole was just getting started. While the East Edge Crew was rising in East London, Another force was preparing for a comeback in the shadows of the South. The South Blades had once been the most feared gang south of the river, known for their brute force and violent retaliation. But after a few high-profile arrests and internal betrayals, their control had started to slip. Now, with East Edge pushing into their claimed territory and humiliating their members in public attacks, the South Blades were under pressure to strike back hard, or risk fading into irrelevance. At the center of the South Blades operations was Andre Barrett, known on the streets as Blitz. A former cage fighter with a fractured nose and a body covered in scars, Blitz had survived more street wars than most people could count. He wasn't loud, but his presence carried weight. His hands were as deadly as the guns he kept hidden in the floorboards of his house. Blitz didn't believe in social media threats or empty warnings. He believed in revenge served quietly and violently. After the East Edge ambush that left 3 of his boys bleeding at a bus stop, Blitz went underground. Literally, he stopped making public appearances, stopped showing his face in clubs and street corners. Instead, he turned his attention to a crumbling boxing gym in Brixton, a place he once trained in before the gang life took over. The gym, now abandoned and unnoticed by police, became his war room. Inside, Blitz rebuilt his network. He brought in an old contact from Eastern Europe, a man known only as Victor, who specialized in smuggling illegal firearms into the UK through refrigerated trucks. Within weeks, the gym's storage area turned into an underground arsenal. Pistols, shotguns, and even a few automatic weapons were wrapped in blankets and hidden behind fake walls. Blitz knew that to match Darren Cole's rising power, he needed more than knives and fists. He needed firepower and fear. Meanwhile, the South Blades began preparing for open confrontation. Blitz recruited younger members with nothing to lose. Teenagers kicked out of school, boys with no father figures, and kids already caught in minor crimes. He trained them ruthlessly, not just in street fighting but in how to move silently, how to follow targets, how to strike and vanish. These weren't just gang members anymore. They were soldiers in a personal war. Their first major retaliation came on a rainy Thursday night. A known East Edge lieutenant named Rafim was ambushed outside a takeaway in Deptford. Witnesses reported masked men on scooters circling the shop for an hour before rushing him with machetes and a baseball bat. Rafim survived, but barely. The attack was brutal, fast, and clearly a message. From there, the violence escalated. Safe houses associated with East Edge were firebombed. Cars belonging to Darren's family members were torched. In one shocking incident, a school was placed on lockdown after gunshots were heard just outside the gates. 2 East Edge runners had been targeted during school hours. Blitz had no intention of keeping this war clean. He wanted Darren rattled, exposed, and ultimately erased. Darren Cole, however, was not someone who panicked. The retaliation only pushed him to become colder and more calculated. He doubled security around key crew members and started sending decoys during drug runs. He even changed the drop locations each week, never using the same street twice. But the pressure was mounting. The streets were tense. Uninvolved locals began moving out of neighborhoods that had turned into battlegrounds overnight. The police, overwhelmed and underfunded, struggled to contain the situation. Most victims refused to talk. CCTV footage often showed masked faces and untraceable mopeds. Witnesses stayed silent out of fear. Paramedics grew used to rushing into scenes with stab wounds, burns, and blunt force injuries. Even emergency responders began asking for escorts in certain areas. Despite the chaos, Blitz remained invisible. He didn't use phones. He didn't leave digital footprints. Rumors spread that he had left the country, but in reality, he never left his gym. It was his bunker, his control center, and his shrine to revenge. And while the media remained fixated on Darren Cole's growing empire, Blitz was crafting his own comeback from the ruins of the South. Then came a turning point. Darren, eager to put an end to Blitz's operations, received intel about the boxing gym and its hidden weapons. He ordered a crew to strike. In the dead of night, they launched a firebomb attack on the facility, hoping to cripple Blitz's base of power. Flames erupted, sending thick smoke into the sky. But Blitz wasn't there. The gym was a decoy, emptied out 2 days earlier. Darren had fallen for a trap. That failed raid marked the beginning of a deeper war. One no longer fought in the open, but in the silence of backrooms, alleyways, and ambushes, a war where every move had consequences and no one could be trusted. The war between East Edge and the South Blades was reaching a boiling point, with blood on both sides and the police closing in. But just when it seemed like the two gangs would destroy each other completely, a new name entered the picture. The Wolfpack Syndicate. Based out of Manchester, the Wolfpack had built a quiet empire of crime over the past decade, avoiding public attention while pulling strings across cities. Unlike the street-level gangs obsessed with image and intimidation, the Wolfpack operated like a corporation. Cold, disciplined, and built for profit. At the top of the syndicate were twin brothers, Reese and Ryan Foley. They were in their early 30s, smart and ruthless. Both had criminal records dating back to their teenage years, but nothing that ever stuck. They kept a low profile, rarely appeared in public, and left the dirty work to their carefully selected enforcers. Their specialty was arms dealing and money laundering, and their reach extended into Europe. They had contacts in Spain, connections in the Netherlands, and access to shipping lines that made customs officials nervous. The Wolfpack had eyes on the streets of London for years, but never found the right gang to partner with, until they heard about Darren Cole. By now, Darren had built East Edge into a dominant force, but the war with the South Blades was draining his resources. Police pressure was increasing, weapons were hard to come by, and trust inside the crew was starting to crack. Then the Wolfpack approached, through an encrypted message delivered by a middleman. The offer was simple weapons, vehicles, clean money, and European supply routes, in exchange for a cut of East Edge's profits and complete silence about the partnership. Darren knew it was dangerous. He also knew it was necessary. Without serious backing, his crew would either be wiped out by Blitz or taken down by the police. He agreed to the deal. The transformation was immediate. Within weeks, East Edge was better equipped than ever. Glock pistols, encrypted smartphones, bulletproof vehicles, and burner cash flowed into their operation. The gang stopped fighting like a street crew and started operating like professionals. Gone were the chaotic stabbings and public brawls. Now targets disappeared without a trace. Enemies were taken out with surgical precision. No noise, no mess. Even Blitz felt the shift. He began losing lieutenants at an alarming rate. Safe houses were raided, cash stashes vanished, and his runners disappeared. The South Blades, once known for their brute force, now found themselves constantly on the back foot. Blitz started suspecting that there was something bigger behind Darren's sudden upgrade. But no matter how hard he searched, the Wolfpack remained a ghost in the shadows. The Wolfpack didn't just provide weapons and money. They reshaped the way East Edge operated. Darren was introduced to encrypted banking systems, foreign shell companies, and digital laundering techniques. Some of East Edge's operations were moved offshore. Drugs were now shipped in from Spain and distributed through secret drop locations mapped out using GPS coordinates and rotating codes. The risk of detection dropped, and profits doubled. But with this rise in sophistication came new rules. The Wolfpack demanded absolute silence, no online presence, no flashy stunts, no attention. Darren enforced these demands strictly. Members who broke protocol were punished or disappeared. Morale inside the crew started to shift. Some members felt they were losing the identity that once made East Edge feared. Others welcomed the professionalism, the money, and the reduced police heat. Still, violence didn't stop entirely. In a move that shocked the city, 5 men linked to the South Blades were gunned down in a single night while sitting in a chicken shop in Peckham. It was fast, clinical, and clearly professional. Police arrived to find bullet casings but no witnesses, no CCTV footage, and no suspects. The operation bore all the marks of a Wolfpack-style hit, but there was no trail to follow. The incident triggered a new wave of panic. News reports exploded. Community leaders demanded action. The police launched Operation Broken Wall, aimed directly at dismantling East Edge. Raids increased. Undercover officers were deployed. Streets were flooded with patrols. At the same time, the Wolfpack grew nervous. Their business model relied on staying invisible. The more attention Darren's war attracted, the greater the risk to their wider operations. Reese Foley sent a clear message through his middleman: bring the war to an end or risk losing their support. Darren was now trapped. The gang he built was stronger than ever, but the walls were closing in. Blitz wasn't dead. The police were circling. And the Wolfpack had no patience for mistakes. Darren faced a decision with no good options, End the war and lose face, or keep fighting and lose everything. Unseen by Darren, his right-hand man Jaden Roach had started asking questions of his own. He didn't trust the new system, didn't trust the twins in Manchester, and above all, didn't trust how quickly everything had changed. Something felt off, and Jaden was about to make a choice that would change everything. Jaden Roach had been with Darren Cole from the beginning. He wasn't just a soldier in the East Edge crew. He was family. They had grown up together in the same block, skipped the same classes, fought the same street battles. When Malcolm Cole was killed, Jaden was one of the few who stood beside Darren through the storm that followed. But now, years later, something inside him was shifting. The East Edge crew wasn't the same anymore. It had become colder, more structured, almost corporate. The new rules brought in by the Wolf Pack had drained the heart out of the gang. Meetings were silent, missions were robotic, and loyalty meant following orders without question. Jaden didn't trust it. He didn't trust the encrypted phones, the unfamiliar accents in the warehouses, or the sudden disappearance of crew members who once laughed and shared meals on the block. Still, he kept his mouth shut, until the night he was pulled over by 2 unmarked police cars near Tower Hamlets. Jaden was alone, returning from a pickup. Inside his car were £60,000 in cash, a Glock 17 pistol with the serial number filed off, and a burner phone filled with encrypted messages, surveillance images, and location coordinates. It was supposed to be a clean run, one he had done dozens of times. But something had gone wrong. The officers didn't ask many questions. They already knew what they were looking for. Jaden was arrested on multiple charges: possession of an illegal firearm, intent to distribute, and suspected involvement in organized crime. When they brought him into the station, it wasn't a uniformed officer who spoke to him. It was a man in plain clothes with a calm voice and a stack of evidence files. They offered him a deal. A reduced sentence, new identity, clean start, if he talked. At first, Jaden refused. He sat through hours of questioning in silence. But over time, the fear began to settle in. He realized something that chilled him more than prison ever could. No one from East Edge came for him. No lawyers, no messages, no instructions. Darren hadn't even acknowledged the arrest. It became clear Jaden had been abandoned. That was the breaking point. He began to talk. What followed over the next 6 months became the largest intelligence dump the Metropolitan Police had received on East Edge since the gang's formation. Jaden gave them names, locations, drop points, financial routes, and details of operations so specific that investigators had to triple-check them before acting. He explained the Wolfpack's involvement, described the inner structure of the gang, and even identified officers on the gang's payroll. Using Jaden's intel, police launched a series of early morning raids across London. In 1 week, they arrested nearly 30 members of East Edge. Warehouses were emptied, vehicles were seized, weapons caches were uncovered behind false walls and beneath garage floors. One house alone contained more than £500,000 in cash wrapped in freezer bags. The gang was collapsing from within. Darren Cole, however, remained out of reach. He had moved underground, constantly switching locations, using burner phones only once before discarding them. But the net was tightening. Surveillance tracked him using thermal drones, traffic cameras, and even informants from rival gangs eager to cut deals of their own. Blitz, long silent during the chaos, disappeared entirely. Some believed he had been killed in a secret deal between East Edge and the Wolf Pack. Others said he had gone underground, waiting for his moment. Regardless, he was no longer a factor in the war's final phase. All eyes were now on Darren. Then came the final mistake. Darren, believing the police were focused elsewhere, attempted to flee the country. Disguised under a fake name and passport, he boarded a ferry to Calais. He had changed his appearance, lost weight, and was traveling alone. But the police had been tipped off days earlier. Midway through the ferry journey, armed officers boarded and pulled Darren from a corner booth. He didn't resist. Inside his bag was over £200,000 in cash, a small handgun, and a passport in the name of Liam Jameson. The arrest was quiet, but the news made headlines across the UK within hours. Darren was charged with over a dozen crimes, including conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, possession of illegal firearms, money laundering, and organized crime activity. The trial was swift. The evidence overwhelming. Jaden's testimony sealed the case. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for at least 18 years. With Darren behind bars and the East Edge crew in ruins, it seemed the war had finally ended. But on the streets, silence doesn't always mean peace, and some fires, even when buried, never really die. Darren Cole's arrest marked what many believed to be the end of an era. His fall was televised, analyzed, and dissected by media outlets across the country. The courtroom was packed with journalists, community leaders, and police officials. Families of victims watched from the gallery, some in silence, others in quiet satisfaction. For years, Darren had ruled East London with fear and control, but now he sat behind glass, no longer a leader, just another prisoner with a number. The East Edge crew unraveled fast after his sentencing. Those who hadn't been arrested went into hiding or fled the city. The Wolfpack, sensing the collapse, severed ties and vanished without a trace. The police never managed to track the Foley twins. Their names weren't even mentioned in the official reports, likely due to a lack of hard evidence and fear of exposing wider corruption. As far as the system was concerned, East Edge had been dismantled and the war was over. But peace was an illusion. Within months of Darren's imprisonment, a new gang began to surface across East and South London. They called themselves the New Blades. Unlike their predecessors, they didn't announce their arrival with music videos or graffiti. They emerged quietly, claiming empty corners and forgotten estates left behind by the East Edge crew. These weren't kids trying to live up to legends. They were survivors, ex-members from both East Edge and the South Blades, joining forces in a brutal alliance to take advantage of the power vacuum. The first sign of their rise was subtle. A teenager found stabbed in Hackney, a weapon stash discovered in abandoned council flat. Then came the more obvious signals: drive-by shootings in broad daylight, coordinated assaults on smaller crews, and videos surfacing on encrypted platforms showing masked figures standing over unconscious rivals. One by one, local neighborhoods began falling under the New Blades' control. They weren't loyal to Darren's old system or Blitz's legacy. Their only goal was domination. Their structure was loose, leadership unclear. That made them harder to target. Police struggled to pin them down. By the time they identified key members, those individuals had already been replaced or killed. Meanwhile, Blitz was still missing. Some believed he had left the country with help from foreign contacts. Others whispered that he had been murdered by his own men after losing power. A few even claimed he was still in London, watching from the shadows, waiting to strike, but no one knew for sure. His name became a myth, a story told to new recruits to keep them sharp. Jaden Roach, the man who once stood beside Darren, now lived under a new identity. The government placed him in witness protection after his testimony. He was relocated to a remote part of northern England, given a new name, a new job, and strict instructions to never return to London. But even there, far from the city's streets, he never truly escaped. The nightmares followed him. The weight of betrayal, the guilt of surviving when so many hadn't. It all stayed with him. He often watched the news, scanning headlines for any mention of East Edge or the Wolfpack. Some days, he felt like he had done the right thing. Other days, he wondered if he had just traded one prison for another. Back in London, the cycle of violence continued. The police celebrated their victory, holding press conferences and launching community programs. But the streets told a different story. Knife crime soared again. Gunshots rang out in areas once considered safe. Young boys still looked up to gang figures, still saw crime as their only escape. For every Darren Cole arrested, another one was waiting in the wings, learning from past mistakes and preparing to write their own legacy in blood. The media eventually moved on. The headlines faded. But for those who lived in the neighborhoods affected by the gang wars, the damage was permanent. Families were broken. Trust in the system was gone. Entire communities had been reshaped by fear. UK gang wars wasn't just a headline. It was a chapter in a much longer book, one that never really ended. The names changed. The tactics evolved. But the hunger for power, money, and respect kept the engine running. Beneath the silence, the war was still alive, waiting for its next leader to rise.